to introduce my friend and colleague Howard Bauchner. Quite recently, in editorial terms, elevated to the high office of Editor-in-Chief of JAMA, and Howard is going to talk to us about scientific integrity and scholarly research. Bravo.
So I have a few comments before I start. First, this is the first chance I've had to thank FEE publicly. It's an extraordinary privilege to have been named the 16th editor of JAMA. And I think if it weren't for my colleagues at the BMJ, you and Alex and Richard Smith, it certainly wouldn't have happened. So I just publicly wanted to thank you. And I have a hat for you to wear, the JAMA Network. I'll give it to you a little later on. People have always asked me frequently what's it been like to become the editor of a well-known journal, a weekly. And I'll tell one story now and then comment about being here. So shortly after I became editor-in-chief, I traveled to Palo Alto to Stanford. And I had arranged a breakfast with John Ioannidis, who I call a nicer, gentler Alvin Feinstein. Abraham Verghese, who's an extraordinary author. And last was Victor Fuchs, who's been an observer for close to 50 years of health policy in the United States. And we were around a table having breakfast, and they started by asking me what I thought the future of American medicine would be. And I said I would only answer the question if I first could get their autographs. And for me, meeting these people repeatedly around the world is extraordinary. And in this room is 10 decades of extraordinary wisdom. Ian Chalmers, Jack Wenberg, and Muir Gray. And for me, it's extraordinary to be privileged to speak with them at this meeting. So FEE invited me here. The title of this talk is The Scientific Integrity in Scholarly Research, the Challenge for Publishers. That was the title I was given. I actually think the real challenge is to editors and not publishers, so I was struck by that. But somehow I feel like Daniel in the lion's den. And this is a depiction of me as Daniel, and FEE is one of the lions. But we will see how this talk goes. So I thought I'd start with a definition of scientific integrity. And I'm going to quote from the Institute of Medicine. For many of you who aren't familiar with the Institute of Medicine, there's approximately 900,000 physicians in the United States. Of about 100,000 are in training. That leaves about 750 or 800,000 physicians. Of that number, 1,500 to 2,000 are members of the Institute of Medicine. It's part of the National Academy of Sciences. It's considered probably the most prestigious group of American physicians. They defined scientific integrity in 2002, both at the individual level as well as at the institutional level. At the individual level, for the individual scientist, integrity embodies above all a commitment to intellectual honesty and personal responsibilities for one's actions, and to range of practices that characterize the responsible conduct of research. They then tried to put it in the larger context of what is an institution's responsibility. Institutions seeking to create an environment that promotes responsible conduct by individual scientists and that fosters integrity must establish and continually monitor structures, processes, policies, and procedures, and they go on for another few sentences. And I think the way in which this is being implemented, for example, particularly at the institutional level, in the United States, by the end of 2013, certainly by the end of 2014, there will be tremendous transparency from pharma, state-level data about the relationship between academic physicians and both industry and as well as other funders. And I think that's a way in which over the last decade, both individuals as well as institutions have responded to tremendous concerns about conflicts of interest. I would like to point out, which is what's really quite striking to me, when you speak to our colleagues, at least in the United States, in the economic world, the legal world, or the business world, they are at least a decade behind in any declaration of conflict of interest. It's striking that you will often see in the United States many members of the business or economics, academic departments widely quoted, and you will never know that they will have consulted to companies that they are being asked about. It is striking to me that in this case, medicine is probably a decade or two ahead of some of the other professions. Assuring integrity is a challenge for editors, publishers, authors, and peer reviewers. I would argue, as an editor of a weekly magazine, a weekly journal, it is probably my single most difficult task to ensure the scientific integrity of what we publish. On Wednesday of this week, we will publish probably the single most controversial paper in cardiovascular disease, a randomized clinical trial that's been conducted over the last 5 years. Accompanying it is not only an editorial about the paper, but an editorial written by Phil Fontana-Rosa, Rob Golub, and myself about why we published the paper and the safeguards that we've taken to ensure the validity of the results that will be reported. And it's a striking example of the work that we put in, the effort we try to mount to ensure the scientific integrity of what we publish. It is relevant to all of the content of a journal. One could argue, actually, it's more important for the opinion pieces. I was speaking with someone yesterday who talked about whether or not our long ICMJE forms should still accompany all of the articles that we publish. If you go to some journals, it's published online, and you read the paper, and you have to work very hard to get it. We remain committed to printing it either online or in actual print so that you can see it when you read it and that you don't need to search for it. And even though that takes up a great deal of space, we believe it helps the reader understand the context of the person who's writing that piece. Some would say that that information is actually more important in opinion pieces, viewpoints, and editorials than it may actually be in original research. And why? Even though we peer review editorials and viewpoints, it's not done at most journals to the same extent that it's done for original research. It begins with the submission, it concludes with the publication, but it continues with media briefings, post-publication comment, and what I've now commented or will talk about, which is mandated data collection. So many of the struggles, particularly around devices and new drugs, has been in the post-phase 3 data collection period. And the FDA, over the last 5 years, and more recently, approximately 2 weeks ago, announced new plans for much more mandated, extensive collection of data in the post-phase 3 trials, in part because we all know that when you go from an RCT of 10,000 to general use of a drug in 50,000 or 100,000, changes are inevitable. Ensuring scientific integrity is essential to ensure trust. It's a fundamental principle of science and certainly of publication. I refer to these to the hierarchy of sin. So I told you the story of my encounter at Stanford. Unfortunately, I have a weekly encounter with each one of these. Unethical research, fabrication and falsification, conflict of interest, incomplete reporting, misrepresentation, and plagiarism. As much as I'd like to say, trial registration has helped with some of these. Just last week, we received notification through forensic statistical analysis that someone believes 2 papers that we published in JAMA in 2007 were fabricated. That's an enormously important charge, and it will take us certainly hours and many months to conduct our own investigation. Last year, Anvil Patti from Duke University was accused of fabrication. A number of his papers, one which was in Nature, was withdrawn, retracted. He had published 2 papers at JAMA, one based upon the findings in the Nature paper, and that paper by us was quickly retracted. Duke University requested that we retract the other paper. We refused. It was not based on the data that was published in Nature, and we requested that they conduct an investigation and provide us the information about that investigation. It took them about 9 months to finish it, but they indicated at the end that they thought that the data in the second paper in JAMA was accurate, and that paper was not retracted. And so all of these issues are something that we confront on a weekly basis. Scientific integrity. Assuring integrity is a challenge. Oops, wrong way. Got it. It's the responsibility of authors. Read your paper. Know your co-authors. Access to and verify data. It remains remarkable to us around authorship disputes that people will often say at the end, I didn't really read the paper, but I would like to be an author. We received a report about a year ago. It came in with 180 authors. It would have taken one of our editorial assistants 2 weeks to gather all of the ICMJE forms. I emailed the lead author and said it was difficult for me to believe in a genetic study of about 80 people that there could possibly be 180 authors. I was trying to do the ratio. I think it was 2 to 1. And he reconsidered when I sent him the ICMJE form, and about 2 hours later said there was only 90 authors. I thought if I just kept emailing him every 2 hours, I could get it down to a reasonable number of authors. But I was struck by his lack of understanding regarding at least the ICMJE authorship obligations. They are and statements, they are not or statements. We have been impressed on numerous occasions with the attention that peer reviewers have given to scientific integrity, not only around the type of data that's been analyzed, but where did those data come from, who did the analysis, and was it accurately interpreted. And so I believe, since we all participate as peer reviewers, it's also our obligation regarding scientific integrity. It's certainly the responsibility of editors and publishers. We investigate, we do due diligence, we try to create recourse, and we notify institutions. We've done this on a number of occasions since I arrived in the last 18 months, and we will continue to do it. In general, we conduct our own investigations. I just received a notification on Monday of this week from a European institution suggesting that a paper that we published last year may have been plagiarized. There were no additional data in the email. It did come from an administrative assistant. I emailed the individual back, and with great courtesy, I said, one, I need a little more information than you think it may be a plagiarized paper. And secondly, under these circumstances, I would only have exchanges with the person making the allegation, that there could be no one between me and the individual making those allegations. I would also say at JAMA and across the JAMA network, as you know, we've renamed the 9 journals. In general, myself and Phil Fontana Rosa do all of the investigations around scientific integrity. Approaches to ensuring integrity. There are few data and virtually no evidence. Starting with the 4th bullet down, independent statistical analysis. Under the leadership of my predecessor, Kathy DeAngelis, in 2005, JAMA announced and continues to be, I believe, the only journal in the world that requires independent statistical analysis of industry-analyzed research. Does it work? I have no idea. It has not been a randomized clinical trial. I do know it's cost JAMA dearly. It's cost JAMA dearly because it's very clear that some very influential and important authors have decided to take their manuscripts elsewhere. So there has been some cost to JAMA. Many of these recommendations, which I'll comment on a bit more, remind me of two observations, and it's why I said there's virtually no evidence. There was a wonderful, wonderful BMJ Christmas issue about 10 or 12 years ago, and it was poking fun at the EBM people, and it was someone about to jump out of an airplane. And they were randomized to the control group, and the other person was randomized to the parachute. And the EBMer said, I don't need an RCT when the evidence is overwhelming. So that's one example, is it's so clear that these will work that we should just adopt them. But the other is we were certain about hormone replacement therapy. We were certain about hemoglobin A1C and lowering it. We were wrong on two major issues. So even though all of these are being trialed or proposed, there may be unintended consequences that we're uncertain about. Harlan Kumholtz, a cardiologist from Yale, has a piece in the March 20th issue of JAMA about calling for data transparency. But I've asked Robert Califf, who's provost of research at Duke, to write about what could be the unintended consequences of data transparency. Trial registration, there's been reports in the BMJ, New England Journal, PLOS, and JAMA kind of characterizing the first decade of trial registration. There's been progress. More trials are registered. More trials are registered on time. But the reporting in them is scanty. It's very hard to derive it from clinicaltrials.gov. Much of the data, after it's publicized, is not re-entered in clinicaltrials.gov. And indeed, there's an element in all of these studies that suggest that industry-supported studies are more adherent to the regulations and rules of clinicaltrials.gov than non-industry supported research. It's critical that the corresponding author have full access to data. We've been very, very pleased over the last 6 months that there's been a number of industry-analyzed studies that have been submitted to JAMA for publication that have already come in with an independent statistical analysis already completed. We didn't even need to request it. Obviously, tomorrow we will discuss all trials. The question about data transparency has arisen, and I think it's certainly something we at JAMA will discuss and debate over the coming 6 months. Phil Fontana Rosa and I, this is particularly specific in the United States, have asked for a delay in any marketing campaign for drugs until the data collection mandated by the FDA is complete. That goes to the issue about the change in adverse events that arise after a drug leaves the clinical trial arena and moves into the general population. And then finally, it will be striking to understand how the FDA responds to the EMA's, what will be their release over the coming years of public display or public availability of data. The FDA has not yet weighed in on that issue. I think, as many of you are aware, the FDA tends to be somewhat more conservative than the EMA. I don't think it's likely in the United States that that same access to data through regulatory bodies will occur, but there's been surprises in the past. And I want to leave Fee with a note. I put her in the lion's den as a lion, but I couldn't wish for a better partner in ICMJE than Fee Godley. Thank you very much.